I wanted to just give you a little bit more thinking about one of the words that we talked about when we were talking about pace. And it's the last one, empathy. And I wanted to do that positively because it's, I believe, such a key part of how we do pastoral care and counselling. And also, I guess in less positive terms, more reactive terms, because if you've not picked up, there's been some controversy, mainly kicking off in the States, but filtering across here around the concept of empathy. And so I thought it was worth just spending a bit more time talking about that. What do we mean by empathy? And one of the reasons that the idea is controversial is because it's not one of those words that you can go and find a direct equivalent in scripture. So you'll recognise, if you're familiar with languages, that it's not an English origin word. It's been imported from somewhere. In fact, it's an importation of two Greek words. Empathy has the idea, if you put those two words together, of feeling or even suffering in. So pathos, that sense of suffering, that sense of experiencing, and is a sort of variation on one of the Greek prepositions, so suffering and feeling and experiencing in. Just as you've got sympathy, which is to experience, to feel, to suffer with. And historically, it's the word sympathy that you will find gets used. So that in that point where the writer of Hebrews talks about Jesus as our great high priest, he talks about Jesus being one who is able to sympathize with us in our sufferings. That Jesus is the one who has been tempted in every way but without sin. And the word empathy is actually fairly recent, fairly new. So we're talking the last 100, 200 years that this word has begun to develop. Initially, I understand it was involved in a word that was used in terms of understanding art, the idea that you could step into the artwork, if you like, and to see it, to experience it from the inside, to empathise with the creator, to feel the very emotions and senses that they did as they created it. And then it began to be used increasingly in terms of counselling and therapy, but also began to be used to describe, in effect, a kind of an ability, a talent, a virtue, if you like. The idea that those that are seeking to come alongside and help other people need to be able to empathise with them. That leaders, before they can lead, need to have a connection with those that they are leading. That teachers, as they teach, need to have that connection with those that they are teaching. In fact, empathy probably is relevant to our preaching and teaching as it is to our one-to-one discipleship and pastoral care. And in terms of the sort of the recent theological sort of Christian debate, I think it's that recentness of that specific word that has affected that debate. So what people are picking up on is that there is a word that's used in the Bible, and that there is this different word being used now. And I think them picking up on the kind of the very literal meaning, suffering in. So the argument goes something like this. Sympathy is a biblical word. We are called to suffer with others. Empathy takes it too far. It disconnects us from any sort of mooring, any safety, and plunges us into the person's experience. So we suffer in their suffering, we experience, we feel, and so we identify with. And particularly when you've got words like non-judgmental, that means that we basically accept and even approve of how they are responding and how they're experiencing without any regard to their responsibilities. And the cause is that we understand why they have done the things they've done and why they feel the way that they feel, so that there isn't any room for challenge or correction. I think that's to misunderstand how language develops. I think that's to misunderstand what we mean when we talk about biblical concepts as well. And there are lots of words that we use as Christians to sum up things that are very clearly biblical, but either that word is not used in the Bible, or if it's there in the Bible, it's used differently. So to give you two examples, when we talk about the Trinity, when we talk about who God is, the one God in three persons, we are using the term Trinity, triunity, so one and three, to describe God, but that word is not found in the Bible. However, as you read the Bible, you realize that what we mean by Trinity is not a foreign concept, and it's very clearly being taught and revealed in Scripture, particularly as we see the Son showing us the Father and showing us his relationship to the Father, and then promising to send another counselor or comforter. The other word worth mentioning is the idea of sanctification. Now, the Greek word that you might literally translate sanctification from is there in the Bible. That's where we get the same sort of language that we talk about saints. And Paul writes to all the saints, and that call to be holy, to be sanctified. There's a different root word, so the Greek root word is slightly different, but the Latin equivalent is very much present. So sanctification is a term that you might say is a biblical term, but biblical scholars would also say, but actually, when we talk about sanctification today, we tend to talk about progress, about growth in holiness, about becoming more godly, about learning to be obedient, our growth in holiness. But in fact, when you look at the word in the New Testament, it doesn't tend to be used in that sense, that the equivalent word is describing a status that we have, a positional holiness, that we are sanctified. It's the immediate, that it's who we are. So you could get yourself into knots and say, well, okay, then the idea of sanctification that we have today is not a biblical idea. But of course it is. The Bible talks about training yourself to be godly. It talks about purifying yourself if you have that hope of one day being glorified when you meet Jesus face to face. 1 John 3, that's 1 and 2. And that's helpful as we think about empathy. Is empathy a biblical concept? Is it there? I think it's helpful to consider how words change and develop. So I think what we've seen is this. Yes, if you look at the New Testament and you look at that word used to describe Jesus, it's the root of sympathy that we feel, that we suffer, that we experience with. That's what Jesus did. However, the problem is that over time, that word sympathy has become so well used become so comfortable with it, but we've also allowed its meaning to be diluted and weakened, if you like. And so sympathy today feels very much like an arm's length thing. You get the intimacy, the closeness of Jesus being the one who sympathizes with us, because he is no stranger to suffering and because he has experienced and resisted temptation. But that word sympathy doesn't tend to carry those same kind of connotations. I've got a friend who's a Manchester City fan. I've got friends that support lots of different football teams. And you see I'm wearing my Bradford City top today. Now Bradford City are languishing down in League Two, right down in the bottom basement. Actually, they're not languishing. They're languishing in terms of comparison to those big Premier League teams, or even the Championship or League One. But they're doing all right in League One, and they've had, in many respects, a good season. It looked at one point like they might even win the league, and then the last few weeks the wheels have kind of come off the bus, and they've had players sent off, and they've drawn or lost games in the last few minutes. So that feeling that, those sending offs and those last few minutes of a couple of games have made all the difference. They could have run away with the league. Instead, we're in a situation where as I record this, we're in a situation where we've got one last game to play. By the time you watch this, we'll know the outcome. But that last game, we could either secure that final promotion spot if we win, or if we draw and the other teams lose that are just behind us, or we could just miss out. And that means that if, like me, you're a Bradford City supporter, actually, at the moment, there's a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety. We want to be really excited about Saturday, but we're also very, very nervous. Understandably, if you're a Bradford City supporter. When Bradford City got to the last time that they got promoted out of this division, they did it through the playoffs, and Sarah and I went to Wembley to watch them. And very early, they took control of that game against Northampton, and they found themselves 3-0 up in the first half. And my wife turned to me and said, look, because she's not a Bradford City supporter, she's adopted the team. And she said, you can relax now, can't you? And every single supporter around me agreed. I just said, no, we can't. I said, but you're 3-0 up. And she said, yeah, exactly. We've managed to score 3 goals. We can let 4 in the second half. That's the kind of thing we're likely to do. As it happened, we didn't. We got promoted that time. Now, my friend, the Manchester City fan, might be sympathetic to my plight. He might say, yeah, I can see how tense you are about this. But he's got no real understanding of what it means to suffer the challenges and misfortunes of lower league football. It's not a position that he really can identify with. He's used to supporting this big team that, a bad season is still finishing in the top 4 and getting to an FA Cup final. But other supporters of lower tier teams, whether that's football or other sports, they can identify with what I'm going through. They can empathise. And so today, when we talk about sympathy, we tend to mean that a person can show pity, concern for the experience, the emotions, the suffering of others. But actually, we're not really saying that they are suffering with. They are observing and seeking to respond to that suffering, and they're offering their condolences, they're offering their pity, their care. It's the sort of thing that you then have. You think about a bereavement as a more serious thing. You think about the person who says, "I'm so sorry for your loss." That would be seen as with sympathy. In fact, we send cards, don't we, saying with sympathy. But it's actually very different to say, I can get a sense of what you're going through because I've been through that. And empathy at its strongest, I think, has that sense of, I get that because I've been through it, or something like that, something comparable. Now, the reality is that we are not going to always have been through the same things, although I think there's a sense that generally we suffer. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But empathy then is more broadly seen as having that ability, even if you've not had the experience, to put yourself in the person's shoes and feel what they feel. To see things from their perspective, like I said, to put yourself in their shoes. And I want to suggest that that's important for Christian discipleship, for pastoral care, for pastoral counselling, as I mentioned before, for preaching as well. That we need that empathy. People are shouting in the background. I just don't realise it's possible that they're Walsall fans that have seen my Breakfast City tour. They can empathise in that they're in the same quandary as we are. They've had a good season, then fallen away, to see their team collapse, but probably won't want to empathise with a rival team. Back to the topic, that's the joys of recording live. Anyway, empathy then becomes an ability, a quality, a gift, if you like, that is so helpful as we seek to care for other people. Now, as I've suggested, it's a gift. That means that there are going to be some people for whom that comes to them naturally, easily. But I also would suggest that that's not an excuse for us to say, oh, I've just not got that gift, I'm not empathetic. I think there are things that we can either have the gift naturally, or we can have it supernaturally where God just gives it to us. But also there are things that we need to work at to be better at, even though it may not be the thing that we are strongest at. And so what we do with empathy depends on, as a gift in that kind of way, depends on where we sit. Now, one way to look at it is this, to say, if somebody just has no aptitude and no desire for empathy, then perhaps they shouldn't be getting involved in pastoral care. I am, even you probably realise from this, asking questions about the implications of lacking empathy and being in any form of Christian discipleship type ministry and leadership. Be careful about that. But at the same time, I think there are some questions to ask. But if it is very clear that this is where God is placing us, this is what God is asking us to do, then I would encourage you to desire the gift. I'd encourage you to seek it. And that involves praying, asking God to give you this gift, this ability to be empathetic. But also to be saying, I'm going to be working at it. And even if you've got this natural empathetic ability, you still want to cultivate, to grow, to develop in that gift. So, in summary, empathy is about being able to put yourself in the shoes of others and see things from their perspective, so that we are alongside them, we are with them, we're close to them, it's intimate, we suffer with, we feel with, we experience with, we see things from their perspective, experience things from their perspective, to help us to connect with them, to be with them. That has the benefit. First of all, it helps us to connect with them. It helps them to know that they're not on their own, and it's going to put you in the context where you can speak God's truth into somebody's life. It's a gift, but that means that we are to seek it and we are to cultivate it. I hope that that's been helpful, just to start to think that through, and I encourage you to just stop and do a bit of self-evaluation. First of all, do you consider yourself empathetic? Secondly, do others see you as empathetic? If you're not sure, go and ask someone. Thanks for listening in.